5 years ago, I read a fascinating article that argued you could learn more by watching the movies of Indiana Jones than by studying 10 years in film school. Sounds crazy, right? But the writer has a point. Indiana Jones, he argues, is actually more complex than he seems. He takes a proactive role in his stories, has a really perverse dark side, and presents an arc in both each of his adventures individually and in the overarching narrative of the entire saga. Now, for me, this article was a godsend, and I'll include the link below. Give it some love and try this experiment out for yourself. Trust me, it's worth it. See, I had long thought that the Indiana Jones series had more depth than some critics had given it credit for. It's easy to write them off as just popcorn films. But not all popcorn films become cultural icons. Most just get lost in the mix. But why is that? One word: character. Jones is oddly fascinating. He's not a muscle-bound Schwarzenegger, and he's not an altruistic Superman. He's a flawed, breakable heel prone to just winging it. Yes, he's a man of action, but those actions define his experience and make him who he is. Of course, the experience was shown out of chronological order. The second film, Temple of Doom, is really a prequel, and the third film, Last Crusade, features a flashback that predates all of them. So what can we learn by watching the series in this order? Could it function as one large movie like the Lord of the Rings trilogy? What would it say about Indy's character arc? And what lessons can we learn about crafting compelling action protagonists? We'll explore that with a deep dive into this series. So grab your trusty whip and make sure your gun is fully loaded, because we're keeping up with the Joneses. This is Indiana Jones and the Raiders of the Lost Character Arc.
Everybody's lost but me.
So let's plunge into this. Now, going forward, we're going to treat this as one giant film. So suspend your disbelief and pretend the various opening credits just don't exist. We'd start off with the flashback to young Indy's first adventure in Utah. This is Proto-Indy. Brash, confident, but very much an Eagle Scout who wants to do the right thing. A group of shady treasure hunters find the Cross of Coronado, and Indy insists it belongs in a museum. In this sequence, we learn a number of things. We see where Indy's spear of snakes comes from, we see him use a whip for the first time, we see his standoffish father obsessing over lost archaeological lore, and finally, we see Indy's first lesson. You do the right thing, you lose. This guy, who gives Indy his hat, becomes his first mentor, a surrogate replacement for his busy father. And if you ever wonder why Indy seems like such a shady guy, just look at who inspired him. So the mysterious Fedora Man puts his hat on Indy, crowning his loss, and then we fade to the bashing of a Chinese gong. And here, Willie Scott emerges from the smoke. We're now in Temple of Doom. At this point, we see Indy for the first time, and let me tell you, having done this experiment myself, this scene plays so much better after cutting from the backstory. I mean, look at him. He looks like James Bond crossed with Rick from Casablanca. This is the Indy that took his first lesson to heart. Playing fair is for suckers. And look at what we get. He's a misogynist who threatens women. He enters shady deals with Chinese gangsters. Mr. It belongs in a museum is willing to trade a priceless archaeological artifact for a diamond. He's no different from the Fedora Man tossing the Cross of Coronado to his thug buddies. Even worse, he gets his partner killed. And to top it all off, he's totally exploiting some local kid. This sends him flying down a mountainside and stumbling into a remote Indian village. There, he's beseeched by the village to help recover some stones and save some local children. And this is an important point. He doesn't seek this quest. He just falls ass backwards into it. And why does he accept this quest?
Fortune and glory, kid. Fortune and glory.
At the Temple of Doom itself, we see various political intrigues play out. The subtext is this: an ancient evil that was squashed out by civilization tries to revive itself by exploiting their own. The Brits may think of themselves as a civilizing force, but they're also imperial overlords, and this Indian kingdom, under the shadow of a cult, wants vengeance. And so the rules are bent and children are exploited. Who else relies on child labor? Jones. But this is a common theme with the series' villains. They always end up being the flip side of Jones's coin. Jones may have a dark side, but there's always someone worse that forces him to do the right thing. He may be this, but he's not that. Now, you can all argue how the film's portrayal of this Hindu cult is problematic. I don't care. I'm just the messenger. For better or worse, that's the movie's pretext. Oh yes, we stamped out evil, ho ho ho, cheerio and all that. It is what it is, and it's up to this scumbag anti-hero to solve the problem. And if you don't think Jones is an anti-hero, remember what the Prime Minister says. Jones's head, hands, and balls are all wanted by numerous authorities for plundering priceless artifacts overseas. By the way, the Prime Minister is also another flip side of Jones. He's a westernized, suit-wearing, placating university man who plays both sides to conceal his own ends. Like Jones, he leads a double life. On the relationship front, it's interesting that Willie Scott is the first on-screen woman we see in Jones's life. She's obnoxious, he's misogynistic. They can't stand each other. He lives to troll her, and her very presence as a spoiled lounge singer derails him at every turn. As a starting point in Jones's on-screen relationships, this is rock bottom, and there's nowhere else to go but up. Philosophically, Jones is a Western skeptic who seeks to exploit the riches of foreign countries. Ironic then that he is exploited by the dark, supernatural forces of a foreign country, particularly one the West thought it had subjugated. He's forced to reckon with his dark side, but goes through the threshold to save his friends. In the end, he admonishes the villains for betraying their gods and sends them literally down shit creek without alligator repellent. He then returns the exploited children to their village and hands over his prize to its rightful owners. Already we're seeing the beginnings of a transformation. And that's when we jump ahead to the forests of South America just 1 year later for Raiders of the Lost Ark. At this point, Jones is at it again, seeking a prize. This time, he loses it to Belloc. See a pattern here? A fun little tidbit about this series is that Jones hardly ever gets to keep his treasure. The prizes are just Macguffins. Now, a Macguffin is a plot device used in films that sets the characters into motion and drives the story. It's an object, idea, person, or goal that the characters either pursue or serve as the motivation for their actions. They can come in either two forms: one, as a catalyst for the action of the story, or two, as an object that reveals character traits. The artifacts in Indiana Jones do both, but it's the second aspect that's more important. The artifacts change his character, not his wallet. The urn in Temple of Doom went to Lao She, the stones to the villagers. The idol goes to Belloc, the Ark goes to the government, the Grail to the chasm, and the aliens go to the space between spaces. What's the only prize Jones does get back? The one he rightfully wanted to put in the museum in the first place, the Cross of Coronado, that which essentially sent him on his character journey. And that's the point. These movies are about the journey. That's why the Big Bang Theory's observation that Jones is nothing but a passive character who doesn't affect the outcome of anything is pointless. As if these movies were ever about that. God, sorry. I really do not like this show. Anyway, the series isn't about the effect Jones has on the prize. It's about the effect the prize has on Jones. Each one reveals new insights into his character growth. And on the flip side, it also reveals things about the villains. Remember that in Temple, Western civilization was seen as the less gruesome alternative to native human sacrifice. But in Raiders, Western civilization itself is the bad guy. Instead of stamping out supernatural powers, the Nazis are trying to unearth it for their own ends. Enter Belloc and Jones. Two sides, one coin. This time, Jones doesn't stumble into a quest. The quest finds him. He isn't beseeched by civilians, but by the government. And the quest isn't for fortune and glory, but for the study itself. The Ark represents everything he got into archaeology for, and it will go to, where else? Marcus's museum. Unlike Temple, this is a much more intellectual undertaking. Now, Belloc is Indy's shadow self. Both are exploitive and shady, but Belloc straight up betrays his country, working for the propped-up puppet government of Nazi Vichy France. He's Jones unhinged, but they both share peculiar similarities.
You and I are very much alike.
They're both driven by archaeology and intellectual curiosity. The difference is how far they're willing to go to achieve their ends. Belloc operates more like the Temple version of Indy, but in another respect, he's also a step ahead, because the Ark is also a twisted spiritual journey for him.
Jones, do you realize what the Ark is? It's a transmitter. It's a radio for speaking to God.
At this point, Jones is unconcerned with Belloc's search for the divine. Instead, he's more occupied with Marion, an old fling. And if you ever wanted an insight into the sort of character Jones was at the start of this series, look up Spielberg, Lucas, and Kasdan's brainstorming sessions about Indy and Marion's past relationship. It's, kinda ewy. Jones basically had an affair with an underage girl, estranging him from his past mentor. So, unlike Willie Scott, Jones is forced to confront his shady past for the first time. In Marion, he finds a serious upgrade. Hard boozing, rough around the edges, competent. She's the exact opposite of Willie. And it should be noted, she signed up with him.
I'm your goddamn partner!
In return, it's clear he invests more in her than he ever did in Willie. One could argue the lowest, most nihilistic moment for Jones in the whole series is when he thinks Marion has been blown to smithereens. Interesting how Marion was a self-destructive wreck in a dive bar when he found her. Now that there's no chance for redemption, he turns to the bottle himself. Of course, Marion's alive, and it's here that we see Jones wrestling with his old self again. On no less than 2 occasions, he leaves her to the Nazis, once in a desert tent and once on the unnamed island. Initially, Indy says he just wants the girl. Noble. But when Belloc calls his bluff and dares him to blow the Ark back to God, Indiana hesitates. Belloc is right. At this stage, Indy wants to see the Ark opened just as much as he does. In the end, the technologically advanced civilization is undone by this ancient power, a 180-degree flip from Temple. Having felt the awesome power of the Ark, Jones's casual attitude changes. Sure, the fortune is fine, but he admonishes the government for not taking the Ark seriously.
Fools. Bureaucratic
What'd
fools.
they say?
They don't know what they've got there.
For Jones, this is no longer about the fortune and glory, but the research. And once again, he loses the prize itself, but gains insight and a reckoning with Marion. This takes us to Last Crusade. Here we'd start on the Portuguese coast, 1938. Indy gets punched in the face and squares off against the series' first antagonist, the man who stole the Cross of Coronado. Now, after 2 movies, things have come full circle. After losing the Ark to a faceless bureaucracy, he's returned to his Eagle Scout mantra of, "It belongs in a museum!" Definitely not the Indy we saw in Temple. And chronologically, everything adds up. The Cross of Coronado was the first one that got away, transforming an idealistic kid into a jaded cynic who plunders his way across the globe. But now, Indy gets a piece of his soul back. If you want evidence of this, look at what happens when he's asked to seek the Grail. He refuses. The cross was the endgame. Fortune and glory, intellectual curiosity, it's not enough anymore. As he puts it,
I didn't come for the cup of Christ. I came to find my father.
His father is the last piece of the puzzle. The one conflict left unresolved from before his run-in with the Fedora Man. It's only when his father explains to him what's at stake that he decides to find the Grail himself.
If it is captured by the Nazis, the armies of darkness will march all over the face of the earth.
This marks the first time that Indy becomes the true hero in his own story. Not an anti-hero who stumbles into the right thing, but a man who makes a conscious moral choice to do the right thing. Evil must be stopped. This only happens after he gets the cross back. Let's talk about the villains. This time, Indy is sent on his quest not by some lowly villagers or government agents, but by a capitalist. Donovan is an American industrialist. Evil has now come home to roost in Jones's own backyard. The prize he seeks isn't a potential superweapon, it's immortality itself. Both he and Belloc were playing their benefactors, but unlike Belloc, Donovan knows exactly what his prize will do.
Hitler can have the world, but he can't take it with him. I'm going to be drinking my own health when he's gone the way of the dodo.
The other villain is Elsa. Like Belloc, she betrays her country by working for the Nazi regime. She's also a fellow historian. It's no wonder Jones fell for her. On an intellectual level, she's Jones's equal, and this leads to an interesting point. The more altruistic Jones gets, the more trouble it creates. Remember Donovan's advice?
Dr. Jones, good luck. I'll be very careful. Don't trust anybody.
But this softer Jones does just that. This evolution in his character leads to a great scene where Elsa says she would do anything to get the Grail, and Jones would do the same. He replies,
I'm sorry you think so.
And that's the thing. I totally believe him. because this is not the same Jones from the beginning of the series. Elsa, on the other hand, is a reflection of his earlier self. And what karma! The misogynistic man who played multiple women now gets played himself. It's why the scene where he nearly strangles her is so brutal. Note the word usage.
You stood up to be counted with the enemy of everything that the Grail stands for. Who gives a damn what you think?
You do!
She's right. He's emotionally invested. And it's not because he got played, he's been played before. For Jones, this has literally become a moral crusade, and she is a window into the amoral wretch he once was before getting the cross and his scruples back. He evolved, while the woman he loved did not. This moral evolution eventually culminates in the 3 trials. Only a penitent man who walks in the footsteps of God and makes the leap of faith can retrieve the Grail. Indy does this. Elsa only follows. In the end, Elsa kills Donovan with the very thing he sought, a false Grail. Elsa, meanwhile, dies trying to claim the real thing. As Henry put it,
Elsa never really believed in the Grail. She thought she'd found a prize.
Remember the rule? It's not about the prize itself, but what it reveals. Indy's real prize is stamping out evil, repairing the relationship with his father, and attaining a spiritual awakening.
Illumination.
This only comes after he lets it all go and grabs his father's hand. No fortune and glory, no museums, just lost in the abyss. Father and son were driven apart by this obsession for the prize. Now when letting it go, they truly found each other. Thus, the opening conflict, losing the cross of Coronado thanks to an absentee father, finally resolves itself. And this only happens when Henry calls him Indiana. It's here that Jones finally achieves his individuality and becomes a complete person. This is Indiana Jones's lost character arc, a man who ruthlessly plunders missing artifacts to fill a hole in his soul. But what's missing can't be found from without, but within. As Marcus puts it,
the search for the cup of Christ is the search for the divine in all of us.
Now, I'm not going to deep dive into Crystal Skull. I didn't like that movie, but I will say this. Even if the execution sucked, the ideas behind it still sync up with his arc. Indy isn't recruited, he's abducted. The villain is now a former British agent. The very first allies from Temple now harbor turncoats. The other villain is a communist. Their target isn't supernatural powers, but preternatural ones. In this case, it's aliens, a perfect prize for a communistic, atheistic regime. As for family, Indy forges a new relationship with his son after having lost his father. This brings him back together with Marion, and they get married. Why? As he notes,
They weren't you, honey.
and I'd believe it. One was a spoiled harpy, and the other was, quite literally, a Nazi. What Indy gains is a new phase in his life, marriage and fatherhood. Once again, Indy doesn't get to keep the Macguffin. It kills the villains, exploding them with knowledge. Chart this all out, and you get something like this. Note how we've gone full circle in his family, career, and love life. The son becomes the father, and the father becomes the son. Twice. The women progress from a floozy, to a jilted lover, to an intellectual equal who betrays him, and finally, the previous lover which he marries. The battles progress from a holy war, the Stones, to an arms war, the Ark, to a health war, in this case, longevity from the Grail, to a psychic war based on science fiction. Also note how they line up with the cinematic boogeymen of their day. Ooh, scary Eastern natives doing foreigny things. Nazis, capitalists, and commies. Finally, there's the prizes. Fortune and glory, intellectual curiosity, spirituality, and the passing on of knowledge. Mind, body, and soul. As you can see, the Jones who settles down in Crystal Skull is not the same Jones as in Temple of Doom, but he does resemble the do-gooder Eagle Scout in the beginning of Last Crusade. Some might complain he's too vulnerable in the later films, but he was always vulnerable. Everybody wanted a piece of this jerk for a reason. But in learning to trust in his morality, he still manages to win the day despite some occasional misplaced faith. Amazingly, Jones somehow gets less corrupt as the world around him only gets worse. This is what makes Indiana Jones so compelling, and it's a lesson any screenwriter should take to heart. Action heroes don't have to be perfect supermen who never evolve with the story. They can be flawed, improvising, everymen or women who make mistakes, stumble onto the right path, and find redemption. And the villains, love interests, and plots can evolve or regress along with them. This is what makes them feel real. There is an arc to find. Indy can't win it, but he can achieve it. Construct the story into one movie told in chronological order, and this achievement becomes obvious. Is it perfect? No. I'm not sure why Jones is so skeptical in Raiders when he witnessed Mortal Kombat-style fatalities in India. I mean, he chastises Marcus for trying to scare him with tales of the boogeyman, but he already met the boogeyman, and he has a name.
His name is Molaram, you asshole.
Still, enough of it works that I think you can make a clear argument that Jones isn't just a characterless pawn in an action set piece. He's a brilliant anti-hero who rectifies his past and becomes a true hero. Now, as far as I know, no single cut of all the films exists, but you can try this experiment out in your own living room. Just watch the scenes in their true chronological order and see for yourself. Is there more than meets the eye when it comes to Jones? Is he more complex than we give him credit for? Or should we even care because damn it, Indiana Jones is just awesome and I'm gonna go watch it 1,000 times right now because yeah, awesome. One way or another, let me know what you think. Drop a line in the comments. And if you like what you see, hit that subscribe button. But be careful, cause
X never, ever marks the spot.
Spoiler, X totally marks the spot.